The bush was quiet, that particular kind of quiet that experienced guides learn to read like a sentence written in an unknown language. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of something about to happen. The birds had stopped. The insects had paused. Even the dry grass, which had been whispering steadily in the afternoon heat, had gone still. The kind of stillness that presses against your chest. 12 people were walking single file through the low veld of the Eastern Cape. They were on foot, which is the only way to truly understand African wilderness. Not through a window, not from the elevated platform of a game vehicle, but with the ground beneath your boots and the air unfiltered around you. Their guide was a man who had spent over 2 decades leading people through places like this. He had tracked leopards. He had moved groups calmly away from approaching buffalo. He had read this landscape in every season, in every light. He knew it the way most people know the layout of their own home. And yet what happened next caught him completely off guard. If you want to understand just how fast an elephant can move, just how completely a moment can transform from ordinary to unsurvivable, stay with this. Because what unfolded on that trail is one of those events that permanently rewires the people who live through it. Only 2 people were left standing at the end. And the question of why it happened and whether it could have been prevented still does not have a clean answer. Before we go any further, if stories like this one pull you in, if you find yourself needing to understand what happens when wild animals and human beings occupy the same space at the same time, then make sure you subscribe. These stories are told in full, every detail, every moment, every aftermath. Hit subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Now, let us go back to the beginning. The Cape elephant, Loxodonta africana, is the largest land animal on Earth. The word largest does not carry enough weight when you are standing in front of one. The largest recorded bull elephants have weighed in at over 6,000 kilograms, 6 metric tons of animal moving on 4 legs that compress the earth with each step. Their tusks, in older bulls, can stretch past 2 meters. Their trunks, which contain more than 100,000 individual muscle units, are precise enough to pick a single blade of grass from the ground and powerful enough to uproot a tree that has been standing for a century. The Cape elephant, specifically, refers to the population found across the eastern and southern regions of South Africa, particularly in areas like Addo Elephant National Park and the surrounding private reserves and conservancies. These are animals that carry a history of persecution. In the early 20th century, the Cape elephant was hunted nearly to extinction. By 1931, when Addo National Park was established, there were believed to be as few as 11 elephants remaining in the entire region. 11. What exists today, a population that has grown into the hundreds, is the result of nearly a century of protection and management. But elephants remember, not in the metaphorical sense we often use about animals. They remember in the neurological sense. Elephants have hippocampal structures in their brains that store long-term memories with a fidelity that rivals human recall. They remember individual faces, both elephant and human. They remember specific locations where they found water decades ago. They remember threats. They remember injuries. And they pass these memories and the behavioral responses associated with them down through generations in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. The Cape elephant has a particular wariness around human beings that is baked into its population history. The animals alive today are descendants of 11 survivors, 11 animals that lived through a period of systematic slaughter. Whether that history is encoded in something more than learned behavior is a question that still generates genuine scientific debate. But what is not debated is that Cape elephants, as a population, tend to be less habituated to human presence than elephants in other regions. They are more reactive, more defensive, and more likely to respond to perceived threat in ways that other elephant populations, those with generations of neutral or positive experience with people, might not. This matters to what happened on that walking trail. It matters a great deal. The group of 12 had been walking for approximately 40 minutes when the incident began. They were on a private conservancy that bordered one of the larger protected areas in the Eastern Cape. The terrain was typical low-veld, flat in some places, broken by rocky outcrops and dense thickets of prickly pear and speckboom. The vegetation was dense enough to limit sightlines significantly. In some directions, you could not see more than 10 or 15 meters before the bush closed in. The guide had his tracker working the flank. This is standard practice on foot in elephant country. You want 2 sets of trained eyes reading the environment from different angles. The tracker had been watching fresh spoor, elephant tracks in the sand, pressed within the last several hours. The guides and trackers who work in these environments read spoor the way sailors once read weather. The depth of the impression tells you the weight of the animal. The spread of the foot tells you its age, roughly. The way the track is oriented tells you direction of travel. The freshness of the edges, whether they have crumbled and dried or are still sharp and soft, tells you how recently the animal passed. The track suggested a single bull, a large one, moving through the area sometime that morning. The guide had assessed this information and made a judgment call. The tracks were several hours old. The wind was in their favor. They would continue on the planned route, stay aware, maintain their spacing, and adjust if anything changed. It is worth pausing here to say something about the nature of decision-making in wild environments. There is a tendency, after incidents like this one, to search for the single wrong decision. The moment where someone should have turned around, the sign that was missed, the error that could have been corrected. This search is natural and human, and almost always incomplete. Because the reality of moving through wilderness on foot is that you are constantly making probabilistic decisions with incomplete information. The guide made a reasonable call based on available data. What he could not have known, what no amount of experience could have told him with certainty, was that the bull was not hours away. He was close. He was very close. And he was in a state that no one in the group could have predicted. African bull elephants, when they reach sexual maturity and periodically throughout their adult lives, enter a physiological state called must. This is a period of heightened testosterone and other hormonal activity that can last for weeks or even months. During must, a bull elephant becomes genuinely dangerous in ways that are distinct from their normal behavioral range. The temporal glands on the sides of their head, located between the eye and the ear, swell and secrete a dark, oily fluid that runs down the side of their face. Their urine becomes saturated with a chemical compound that communicates their state to other elephants. Their behavior shifts. They become less predictable, less tolerant, more aggressive, more prone to charging. A bull in must is not looking for a fight in the way a territorial animal might be. He is not guarding food or water or young. He is in a heightened state of physiological arousal that makes him reactive in ways that bypass the usual warning sequence. Elephants, under normal circumstances, have a relatively well-understood threat response. They mock charge, they spread their ears, they trumpet, they bluff. They give you signals. A bull in must may or may not give those signals. The research on this is consistent and sobering. Bulls in must are significantly more likely to initiate contact charges without warning. The bull that was standing in the thicket ahead of the walking group was in must. No one knew this yet. They could not see him. He was standing in a dense stand of speckboom and acacia scrub, facing broadly in the direction of the trail. He had been standing there for some time, not moving, which in itself was unusual. Elephants in must sometimes stand still like this, alert, monitoring, processing. The temporal gland secretion was running freely down the left side of his face. His ears were neither fully spread nor folded. He was neither calm nor obviously agitated. He was something in between, which in an animal of his size and his hormonal state is the most dangerous configuration of all. The group had been briefed, as all walking safari groups are, on what to do if they encountered an elephant. Stand still, do not run, follow the guide's instructions, move together, not separately. Trust the guide. This briefing happens before every walk, delivered calmly and clearly and in full. Every one of the 12 people in this group had received it, and in the abstract, standing in a comfortable building with morning coffee in hand, this information is received and processed in a certain way. It sounds manageable. It sounds like a protocol. What no briefing can fully prepare you for is the sensory reality of a 4,000-kilogram animal erupting from dense bush at a full run from a distance of less than 20 meters. The ground shakes. The sound is not what you expect. It is not a trumpet. Not initially. It is the sound of something enormous moving through vegetation at speed, a crashing, breaking, rushing sound that your nervous system processes as immediate mortal threat before your conscious mind has finished forming a thought. The charge began without any of the standard warning behaviors. No ear spread, no mock advance, no trumpet. He came out of the bush at a speed that people who have never stood near a charging elephant find genuinely difficult to believe. Elephants can reach speeds of 25 kilometers per hour in short bursts. Over a distance of 20 meters, that is almost no time at all. It is less than 3 seconds from the moment of first visual contact to the moment of impact. The guide shouted. His voice was trained and controlled, and he did exactly what he had done in practice and preparation for years. He shouted to hold ground, to group together, to not run, and some of the 12 heard him, and their bodies obeyed. Others, and this is the honest truth of how the human nervous system functions under mortal threat, did not have access to those instructions in that moment. The fight-or-flight response, which evolved over millions of years in a world where running from a threat was often the correct answer, is not something you override with a morning briefing. It overrides you. People scattered. They went in multiple directions, which is the most dangerous possible response to an elephant charge, because it means the elephant can pursue separate individuals and the group loses its cohesion, which is the primary source of whatever deterrent effect a group of humans might have on an approaching elephant. A scattered group is not a deterrent. It is a series of individual targets. The bull connected with 2 members of the group before the initial charge lost momentum. The first impact was with a man who had moved to the left. The bull struck him with his head, which is how elephants make contact in aggression, not with the tusks initially, but with the broad mass of the skull and face. The force of this impact sent the man airborne. He landed hard. He was not gored. The tusks did not connect in the initial strike, but the kinetic energy transferred through that impact was enormous, and the injuries were severe. The second person caught in the initial charge was a woman who had frozen, which physiologically speaking is the third option that the threat response system offers, alongside fight and flight. Freezing is sometimes the correct response in wildlife encounters because many animals respond to stillness. An elephant in must and full charge is not one of them. She was struck by the bull's shoulder as he turned after the first impact. This is a different kind of force, a broad sweeping blow rather than a direct strike, and it sent her tumbling into the brush at the side of the trail. The bull then stopped. This is important, and it is also one of the most difficult things to explain to people who have not witnessed elephant aggression firsthand. Elephants do not always continue. Sometimes, after an initial explosive contact, they reassess. The burst of energy is extraordinary, but it is not indefinitely sustained. The bull stood at the center of the trail, ears spread now, head high, processing the environment. He had done what his hormonal state and his threat assessment had driven him to do. He had made contact. And now, in the sudden stillness that followed, he was reading the situation again. The guide was still standing. He had not moved from his position. This is one of the most extraordinary facts about this event, and it speaks to the level of training and mental discipline that experienced walking safari guides possess. With everything happening around him, with people down and people running, he held his ground and he held his nerve, and he faced the bull at close range, making himself present and visible, which is the correct response even though every biological signal in his body would have been screaming the opposite. The tracker had also held position on the flank. 2 people were left standing, the guide and the tracker. 10 were scattered across the bush, running or down or pressed into the vegetation, and the bull was standing between them. What happened in the minutes that followed was a careful, measured, agonizing process of the guide and tracker working to keep the bull's attention without triggering a second charge while simultaneously trying to account for where all 12 members of the group were. The bull made 2 more mock advances in the following several minutes. Both times the guide held his ground. Both times the bull stopped short. This is the language of elephant threat assessment playing out in real time. He was reevaluating, he was measuring, he was deciding whether the remaining standing figures constituted a continuing threat. Eventually, and there is no clean explanation for the precise moment this happens, the bull turned. He moved back into the thicket. He did not run. He walked, which is another characteristic of the reassessment phase. He had communicated what he needed to communicate, and now he moved away. The sound of his passage through the bush diminished, and then it was gone. The silence that followed was described by every survivor in similar terms. It was the wrong kind of silence. Not the silence of calm, but the silence of aftermath. The sounds came back gradually. Birds first, tentative and high, then insects, then the voices of people calling to each other from the places they had ended up. Of the 12, 10 were physically located within the following 20 minutes. The guide and tracker moved systematically through the area, calling, tracking, checking. 2 people had run a significant distance and needed to be located by sound. One of these was uninjured. The other had fallen while running and had cuts and bruising on her arms and legs. Of the 2 who had been struck directly by the bull, both were alive. This is something that needs to be said clearly, because it is not always the outcome. Both were alive. The man who had received the direct head strike had multiple broken ribs, a fractured collarbone, and significant soft tissue damage to his left side. He was in considerable pain and could not walk. The woman who had been struck by the bull's shoulder had a broken arm and was in shock. Both required medical evacuation, and both received it. The Conservancy's emergency protocols were activated, and both individuals reached hospital within a time frame that the medical staff described as appropriate given the circumstances. The recovery was long for both. Months, not weeks. The physical injuries healed on the timeline that bones and tissue follow. The psychological dimension of recovery was more complex and more variable. Trauma responses to events of this kind are deeply individual. There is no standard shape to how a person puts themselves back together after their body and mind have registered, in the most visceral possible terms, that they came within moments of not surviving. In the weeks following the incident, there were investigations. This is standard and appropriate. The Conservancy conducted its own review. The relevant provincial wildlife authority conducted an assessment. These processes examined the route, the guide's qualifications and experience, the pre-walk briefing, the communication protocols, the emergency response procedures. They examined every decision point in the sequence. What they did not find was gross negligence. What they found was an experienced, qualified guide, making appropriate decisions with the information available to him, operating in an environment that is, by its fundamental nature, unpredictable. They found that the bull's presence in that location was not predictable from the available spoor evidence, that his musthate could not have been known without visual confirmation, and that visual confirmation requires proximity, that in itself creates risk. They found that the guide's response during the charge and its immediate aftermath was consistent with best practice, that holding ground and maintaining presence was the correct call, and that it almost certainly prevented the bull from continuing to pursue scattered individuals. They also found, as these reviews always find, things that could theoretically be done differently, different route choices, more conservative turnaround criteria in relation to fresh spoor, enhanced communication systems. These recommendations were incorporated. They are worth incorporating, but they should not be read as indictments of the guide or as evidence that this event was straightforwardly preventable. Elephant incidents on walking safaris are rare. They are rare because the people who do this work are skilled and careful and experienced, and they still happen because the animal at the center of this story is 4,000 kilograms of wild, free-ranging, hormonally complex creature that has its own imperatives and its own history and its own mind. The Cape elephant, in the context of South African conservation, is simultaneously a conservation triumph and a management challenge. The recovery of the population from 11 animals to the current numbers is one of the most significant rewilding successes in African conservation history. But that success creates its own pressures. Elephants require vast ranges. A bull's home range can extend across hundreds of square kilometers. As the population has grown, the boundaries of its range have expanded into areas where human activity of various kinds occurs. The conservancies that border the protected areas are themselves a conservation tool. They provide additional habitat, they create corridors, they employ local people, they generate revenue through activities like walking safaris that fund the protection of the land and the animals on it. The walking safari, specifically, is an important part of this model, not just economically, but philosophically. There is a quality of engagement with wild land and wild animals that you cannot access from inside a vehicle. You read the environment differently on foot, you smell it, you feel the temperature of it, you notice things that glass and elevation and engine noise filter out. And that quality of engagement, when it is managed well, creates a relationship between people and wild places that is one of the most powerful forces for conservation that exists. People protect what they love. People love what they have truly experienced. Walking safaris create true experience. But walking in elephant country on foot is a fundamentally different activity from walking in an environment without megafauna. Elephants are not the only large animal that creates risk in these environments. Buffalo are responsible for more documented fatalities in African wildlife areas than any other species. Lion attacks, while rare, do occur. But the elephant presents a specific combination of factors that makes it uniquely challenging in the context of guided walks. Size, speed, intelligence, memory, the hormonal variability that musth introduces, and the fact that dense vegetation, of the kind that Cape elephants favor, limits your ability to see them until you are already very close. Guides who work in these environments train extensively. They train in animal behavior, in tracking, in emergency response, in group management. They practice, they debrief, they accumulate experience over years and decades before they are authorized to lead groups into high-risk environments. And the best of them carry a specific kind of knowledge that is not in any manual, a felt sense of the bush that comes from thousands of hours of immersion, that reads the absence of bird calls and the direction of a thermal and the freshness of a track and the way the air tastes in a particular moment, and synthesizes all of it into a continuous, real-time threat assessment. That knowledge is real, and it is valuable, and it has prevented a great many incidents that never appear in any record because the guide read the situation correctly and adjusted, and the group walked back safely, and no one wrote it up because there was nothing to write up. The near misses that are handled well are invisible. The incidents that go wrong are visible. This creates a distorted picture of how walking safaris in wild environments actually function, and it is worth correcting. The bull elephant who charged the group on that particular afternoon was later identified from photographic records maintained by the Conservancy. He was a known individual. He had been in the area for several years. He had a history of avoiding human contact, which is itself a significant data point about his personality, because elephants do have personalities in the genuine sense, stable individual differences in behavioral tendency that are consistent across time and context. This was not an animal with a history of aggression toward humans. He was an animal in must, in dense cover, who perceived a threat at close range and responded to it in the way that his physiology and his history and his threat assessment in that moment dictated. What the Conservancy did not do, and this decision reflects a conservation philosophy that deserves examination, was remove or destroy the bull after the incident. This is a choice that gets made differently in different places and different contexts, and it is never a simple one. There is pressure, after an event like this, to do something, to remove the animal, to prevent recurrence. This pressure comes from multiple directions, from the people who were hurt, from the media coverage that follows, from the sense that accountability requires action of some visible kind. The Conservancy's view, supported by the Provincial Wildlife Authority's assessment, was that the bull had not behaved aberrantly. He had behaved as a bull elephant in must, in dense cover, with a group of humans at close range can be expected to behave. Removing him would not address the underlying variable, which is that must exists and cannot be predicted on a specific timeline from outside visual observation, and that walking in elephant habitat carries a level of inherent risk that is managed but cannot be eliminated. Removing this specific bull would not change that fundamental reality. It would remove one individual from a population that needed every individual for its genetic health and its ecological function. He was monitored more closely in the weeks following the incident. The temporal gland secretion dried. His must cycle ended. He returned to the behavioral patterns that had characterized him for years. He was, in the assessment of the people who know this population best, a healthy, ecologically important bull in a recovering population that represented one of the most significant conservation stories in the southern African region. He remained in the Conservancy. The walking safari program was paused for a period while the review was conducted and the recommendations were implemented. When it resumed, it did so with additional protocols, enhanced spoor assessment criteria, more conservative decisions about route continuation in the presence of recent sign, improved emergency communication equipment, additional training for guides on managing group behavior under stress, specifically on the challenge of preventing scatter responses in the moments following a charge initiation. This last element is one of the most difficult problems in walking safari safety, and it does not have a clean solution. You cannot train 12 tourists in group cohesion under mortal threat, in the same way you can train a military unit or an emergency response team. The briefing is brief and it is verbal, and it is received by people whose nervous systems have never been tested in the way that being charged by an elephant tests them. The guide can model the correct behavior. The guide can shout the correct instructions, but the guide cannot override the autonomic threat response of 12 individual people in 3 seconds. What the improved protocols tried to address was the group's positioning during the walk. Tighter spacing, more deliberate management of the group's shape in relation to terrain features that limit visibility, more frequent checks of the environment, and more frequent communication between guide and tracker. These changes do not eliminate the risk, they reduce it at the margins, which is what responsible risk management in genuinely wild environments looks like. The 2 people who were directly struck by the bull both returned to South Africa in the following year. This is documented. One of them returned to the same Conservancy. She did not walk again. She was not ready for that. But she came back, which says something about the relationship that people form with wild places, even when those places have hurt them. The other wrote extensively about his experience and his recovery, not with anger toward the conservancy, or the guide, or the elephant, but with a kind of reflective honesty about what the event had revealed to him about his own nervous system, his own assumptions, and his own relationship to the idea of controlled risk. He wrote about the moment before the charge, about how the bush had looked and felt, about the specific quality of the light in the late afternoon, that golden, flattening light of the African Lowveld, at 4 in the afternoon, when the shadows are long and the colors are warm, and the world looks, from a certain angle, like it has been arranged to be beautiful. He wrote about how that beauty was real, and how the danger was also real, and how neither of those things canceled the other out. He wrote that he would go back on a walking safari. Not immediately, not without considerable internal negotiation, but eventually he would go back. This is not a universal response, and it should not be held up as the correct one. People who walk away from events like this one and decide they are done with wild places, that the managed safety of urban existence is what they want and need, are making a completely legitimate choice. The idea that bravery requires returning to the scene of a trauma is not true. Recovery looks different for every person, and it is not measured by what you are willing to do afterward. But the fact that some people do return, that the relationship with wild land persists through experiences that would seem designed to sever it, tells us something important. It tells us that what walking in genuinely wild places offers, that quality of full presence, of sensory engagement, of encounter with lives and scales and timelines radically different from our own, is something that for certain people answers a need that is not easily replaced. That what they find in the bush, even in a bush that has charged them and broken their bones, is something they are not willing to surrender. The Cape elephant exists in numbers today because people made choices over decades to protect it. To absorb the costs of that protection, which include the loss of agricultural land and the occasional loss of livestock and the very occasional incident like the one on that walking trail. Those costs are real. They are paid by real people. And the decision to continue paying them is made again and again by conservationists and landowners and government bodies and guides and tourists who walk into the bush knowing the walking is not without risk. The elephants do not know this. They do not know they were once 11. They do not have access to the story of their own near extinction or their slow recovery. They move through the landscape they occupy in the way they have always moved, following water, following seasonal forage, following the social bonds of their family groups, following the hormonal rhythms that govern their reproductive lives. The bull who charged on that afternoon was doing none of these things as a story about conservation or as a lesson about risk. He was doing them as an elephant, as a large, intelligent, physiologically complex animal in a dense thicket in the Eastern Cape, reacting to what his senses and his hormonal state told him was a threat. That is, in the end, what makes these encounters so difficult and so irreducible. The elephant is not a symbol. He is not a lesson. He is not a metaphor for the power of wild nature, or the humility that wilderness demands. Though human minds reach for those framings, because human minds are meaning-making machines, and cannot help themselves. He is an animal with his own imperatives, his own history, his own complex inner states. He does not exist to teach us things. We exist in these encounters, in his world, on his terms, and the terms are not always safe. The 12 people on that trail had signed indemnity forms. They had received briefings. They had understood, in the way that people understand things that have not yet been real to them, that walking in wild elephant habitat carried risk. The forms and the briefings and the understanding were real. And they were also, in some fundamental sense, insufficient to prepare the nervous system for what 3 seconds of an elephant charge actually feels like. This is not a criticism of the process. It is an honest description of its limits. What prepares you for it, as much as anything can, is experience. The guides and trackers who have spent decades in the bush carry something in their bodies, not just their minds, that gives them a different access to their own response in those 3 seconds. The muscle memory of having stood still in dangerous situations before. The felt knowledge that the first impulse is not always the correct one. The embodied trust in the training that overrides, at least partially, what raw biology wants to do. This is what the guide had. This is what the tracker had. This is what allowed 2 people to remain standing when 12 began to scatter. The Conservancy operates today. Walking safaris continue. The protocols that were developed in the aftermath of this incident have been implemented and refined. The guides who work there are skilled and careful, and they love the land and the animals they work with, in a way that is evident in how they talk about them. They have the specific kind of relationship with wild things that comes only from sustained, close, attentive presence over years. And the bull moves through the Lowveld on his own schedule, reading the wind, following the seasonal patterns of food and water, entering and leaving musthings in the hormonal rhythm of his species. He is one of several hundred Cape elephants in the broader landscape, a population recovering from near annihilation, occupying ranges that require ongoing negotiation between wildlife management and human land use, and the various interests that compete across that contested terrain. He does not know he is remarkable. He is simply what he is, which is, if you are standing 20 meters away from him in the late afternoon bush, with the birds going quiet and the grass going still, the most present thing in the world. The speck boom grows back where it was disturbed during the incident. The sandy trail has been reshaped by rain and by the passage of animals. The specific spot where the charge began and ended is indistinguishable now from the surrounding bush. The land does not mark these events. It absorbs them. Life continues in the form and on the scale and at the pace that the land dictates, which is very large and very old and very patient and not particularly interested in the categories that human beings